Not long to go until we find out that final decision on the high-speed rail link. Now, the Chief Inspector of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, gave a speech recently where she tried to tackle what she calls the undiscussables in education. So, to discuss those undiscussables, I'm delighted to say that Amanda Spielman joins us now in the studio. Thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. So, what do you mean when you talk about the undiscussables in education?
We look right across all the services that affect children, education and social care. And something that's become really clear to me over the 3 years I've been doing this job is how often problems come about because we don't talk about things that need talking about. And it's been true in schools, it's true in social care. We do joint inspections. So I think we're publishing a report tomorrow looking at child sexual abuse in the family. And here we found so much evidence that things are being shut down by people not wanting to talk about the difficult stuff.
It's interesting. We'll talk about that report specifically later in the interview as well. So when we're talking about the things that people are afraid to discuss, it does feel that sometimes this is issues of culture, issues of faith, and some of the investigations that you've done, you speak about finding discrimination against girls, in particular in schools. And I think you give 2 examples of a school in Birmingham and a Jewish school in London. What kind of things are you finding?
Well, we found some clear in a school in Birmingham. We found some very, very rigid segregation that meant that boys were always put ahead of girls for everything. Children literally didn't see each other. We found some books in the library that were saying men can beat their wives provided they don't leave their mark, and that women aren't entitled to refuse sex to their husbands.
And this is the Al-Hijra Islamic school in Birmingham that you're referring to?
Yes, but this is a community school. It's a state-funded community school, theoretically for all children. So it's a real problem because you talk about this and people cover it briefly and then it's as though it had never happened. People are very, very reluctant to talk about the very difficult issues that some of these cases raise.
You speak about the Jewish school as well, where some books were redacted, including the reign of Queen Elizabeth I.
Yes, that was another school where girls' education was being very restricted, and not just on the kinds of topics that we know are sensitive for some people around evolution and reproduction, but things as startling as the history of the reign of Queen Elizabeth. The girls weren't allowed to know about that. So there's a sort of slide to shutting down what children are allowed to know. How can we make sure that everybody's prepared for adult life if we let schools sort of narrow and narrow what they do?
How widespread is this?
It's a small minority of schools, but the point is because of our sensitivities about religion, about culture, about ethnicity, we're very, very reluctant to say we've got some really tough issues here where questions of religion, questions of other kinds of rights, the different rights bump into each other. How do we help resolve that? How do we get to something that does recognise that at the end of the day this is about putting children first and making sure that they grow up to become sort of fully British citizens with all all the rights and responsibilities and privileges that entails?
I mean, do you think that some people are afraid of talking openly, I guess, about, as you say, when religious beliefs, when faiths, when personal and cultural faiths come into conflict with, for example, the rights of girls or gay people? Do our politicians need to be a bit braver?
Oh, there's no question that we're afraid. I mean, all the dreadful, dreadful grooming gang stories, all those many, many convictions for child sexual exploitation in practically every part of the country. That has shown so vividly what happens when we censor ourselves, when we don't allow ourselves to acknowledge that there may be a particular dimension to a problem. So it does 2 things. One is it leaves those particular children exposed for far too long to the particular harm, but also it means we don't have the right conversation about what the things are that we need to tackle and how to address them as early as we possibly can. And yes, sometimes that very much affects girls, but it cuts across the board because we've got all these different rights that can bump into each other. So we desperately need, in a lot of these situations, everybody to be a bit braver and calling things by their name, talking about what's there.
I mean, I guess another right that we're talking about is gay and lesbian rights as well. And you think, of course, of those protests outside that school in Birmingham about the teaching of relationship education, family education. Do you think the schools are supported enough in those cases?
I know that the schools absolutely have felt unsupported, and we leave the decisions to schools about what to teach and when. There is some government guidance, but it's pretty high level. There's in practice an immense responsibility on the heads even of tiny primary schools to take on something that is really difficult and contentious in many communities now.
So you say that schools feel unsupported. Who should be supporting them?
Well, the local authorities for community schools, the MATs, local politicians, councillors, MPs, national politicians. We should recognise that there is a real difficulty, a real problem here that remarkably few people are willing to pick up and talk about.
We've been talking about faith, and clearly the majority of faith schools are doing a great job, an excellent job, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
However, there is a new wave of state-funded, voluntary-aided faith schools coming in, initially announced by Theresa May. Do you think we need to look at the number of faith schools in the UK? There's
no sort of general argument that Ofsted has about faith schools, beyond that many of them do a fantastic job. If we look in the state sector, overall, I think judgments for faith schools are at least as good, if not slightly better than all schools. In the independent sector, we see a very different picture, and we see a sort of concerning picture among that relatively small group of schools. But
So what should be done about that then?
The first step is acknowledging the dimensions of the problem and saying we do now have a kind of divergence among parent groups in different cultures, different backgrounds, that makes what we could have assumed everybody would have accepted in a school 50 years ago is no longer by default acceptable to 99 parents out of 100. So we start from further back in having to talk about things, in having to educate parents, in really having to rethink models of education to make sure that we can take things forward and build and unify people rather than reinforcing divisions.
And at the beginning of the interview, you mentioned the report you had coming out on sex abuse. Again, an undiscussable topic for many. And it had some pretty worrying findings. What exactly does it show?
It shows a number of things. It shows, first of all, that a lot of children are getting left in the lurch for months, if not years, through a very, very long drawn-out investigations.
And this is when reports are made about potential sex abuse in the home. Or...
A child is disclosed something that's happened to them at home, which of itself often takes a long while for a child to be able to do. And then sometimes it can be weeks even before the person who's alleged to have done whatever it is even interviewed. It can take a year for investigations to be completed and cases to come to court. And often during that time, all the attention is on the person being investigated. There's almost no attention to the child, and often arrest isn't used, but there aren't bail conditions or restrictions on the individual. So the child may be subject to the same abuse throughout the investigation. And then even when people are convicted, there's often some very weak management of the offenders who come out of prison. Again, restrictions may not be set, may not be effective. And there's a lot of weight put on women to manage contact, sometimes with partners or former partners, which puts a very heavy burden on them, especially when they might have been abused themselves.
So really concerning findings.
And there's a bit of lack of join up as well for the problems that children themselves may develop. Because we find it so hard to talk about, there's an enormous taboo about sex between people who are related. Here we've got things that are essentially manifestations of incestuous relationships and often child rape. We find it so hard to talk about these things and call them what they are.
And why do you think these issues are arising? Is it partly funding? Is it because the agencies don't have the money to do the investigations in a timely fashion? Or, as you say, is it more of a cultural problem where we're scared to talk about it?
I think in this one we've got something that is very deep-seated in probably in every culture around the world. There always has been a terrific taboo around incest, which makes it hard to talk about these things. Nobody likes to think of bad things like this happening to children in their own home. And yet the evidence says that throughout history, across the world, these things always have and always will arise. So it's about being ready to teach people, to explain, to communicate that these things can happen, and joining up the services. This lack of connection is something that we've picked up in a number of the joint inspections that we've done on dealing with domestic abuse, child sexual exploitation. Over and over again, we see this pattern of the different services that are meant to help and protect children finding it hard to talk to each other, hard to share information, harm to create this kind of concerted prompt action. I
just want to finish by talking a bit about Ofsted, because Ofsted is under pressure. Teachers, of course, often talk about the pressure that Ofsted puts them under. At the last election, Labour proposed abolishing Ofsted entirely. This is what the Shadow Education Secretary, Angela Rayner, said. She said, "I believe Ofsted measures poverty, it measures deprivation, it doesn't measure excellence." Is Ofsted biased against schools with more deprived intakes?
It absolutely isn't. What we've said over and over again, we know that it's often harder running schools in disadvantaged areas, and yet we're reporting to parents on what their children are getting. We could never say that this education is good enough for a child in Grimsby, but it's not good enough, wouldn't be good enough for a child in Notting Hill. We have to keep that same standard. And I think if you talk to parents everywhere, they have the same kinds of expectations for their children. No parent would say, because we live here, it's okay that we should get a lesser standard of education. So yes, there are enormous challenges in trying to make sure that the system really can deliver the same quality of education everywhere. But it's also right that the independent inspectorate should look at it and say, what are children actually getting?
Talking about the importance of inspections, there was a policy previously where if a school had been deemed outstanding, then it didn't have to go through these kind of automatic, timely inspections. Some schools weren't re-inspected for a decade. That's now changed. Was that a mistake?
It hasn't changed yet. But a very welcome consultation has been published on...
What was it a mistake to not have these regular inspections of outstanding schools?
Our view is that it was a mistake, and we are delighted that finally this Education Secretary has decided to do something about it, because it's left a lot of schools simply not looked at. And everybody knows that schools are not on as a one-way conveyor. Schools can get worse as well as better. And of course, there's also much more to schools than just the sort of top-line reported results. So leaving schools for 10, 12, even 12 years, even longer, in my view, has been a really retrograde approach.
Thank you so much for being on the programme and talking so frankly about some of those difficult topics. Much appreciated.
Thank you.